Welcome to Crimson Legacy Historians, where the past is not just remembered, but brought back to life with depth and clarity. You are 14 years old, standing in a hall filled with 1,000 eyes, and the man who is supposed to protect you, your father, the most powerful ruler on earth, has just given your body away with a single drunken sentence. You don't understand at first. You only feel the room freeze. The musicians stop playing. The nobles stop breathing. Even the torches seem to flicker in disbelief. Across the banquet floor, the old general who requested you, a man older than your grandfather, is smiling. He knows your father cannot refuse, not here. Out in front of the entire empire, your hands begin to shake. Your mother covers her face. Every woman in that hall knows exactly what has just happened. Your life is no longer your life. And your father, the King of Kings, doesn't look at you. He looks past you at his reputation, at his pride, at the image of a god emperor he cannot afford to crack. When he speaks, he uses only one word. Granted. The guests applaud. The general bows. You stand there swallowing a scream that no one will ever hear. Because in this palace, a daughter's suffering is less important than a king's ego. And this quiet moment of public betrayal is where her story truly dies. Her name was Amestris the Younger, and what happened to her is one of the most disturbing examples of how absolute power destroys even the people it claims to love. Welcome to Crimson Legacy Historians, where we uncover the hidden horrors history tried to bury. Let's begin. Now let me show you how a single decision made at a drunken banquet became the beginning of 14 years of psychological torture. But first, you have to understand the world she was born into. A world where one man's word could rearrange the fate of millions. Xerxes was not just a king. He was the king of kings, ruling an empire so vast it stretched from Libya to the Indus Valley, from Thrace to Ethiopia. Nearly 50 million people lived under his command. And according to Herodotus, who spoke with Persians who served in Xerxes' own court, his word was not advice. It was law. A single breath from his lips could save a nation or erase one. But the true danger wasn't outside the palace walls. It was inside. Because the Persian court was not a home. It was a fortress of silence. A sealed world guarded by eunuchs who owed everything to the king. No rumor escaped. No dissent survived. And everyone inside understood one terrifying truth. The closer you stood to absolute power, the easier it was to be crushed by it. Inside the palace, even the king's own blood lived under rules so rigid they governed everything: where they walked, who they could speak to, the exact moments they were permitted to eat. Privacy didn't exist. Autonomy didn't exist. And for the women of the royal house, especially the king's daughters, life was both elevated and terrifying. They were adored in ceremony, imprisoned in reality, treasures of the empire with even less freedom than its servants. Royal daughters were rarely celebrated in inscriptions. Most were never named in official records. They existed as political currency, bargaining chips, alliance tools, offerings dressed in silk and jewels. And if that sounds dark, what comes next is far worse. What happened to Amestris the Younger was not just tragic. It was something even her own people whispered about in fear. Because in a court where the king's will was absolute, a single mistake didn't ruin him. It ruined someone else. And for Amestris, that mistake was about to be made publicly, irrevocably, in front of thousands. Amestris belonged to this world. But unlike many royal daughters, she occupied a peculiar position. She shared her name with Xerxes' principal wife, Amestris the Elder, known in surviving texts for her fierce and sometimes merciless personality. The younger Amestris, however, was born to one of the king's secondary concubines, a woman of Bactrian blood. Even in a court where beauty was cultivated like an art form, her looks were noted as exceptional. She grew up in the women's quarters of the palace, the harem, educated by eunuchs and elder concubines in dance, music, poetry, and embroidery. And sources hint at something unusual. Xerxes kept her close, even as other daughters were dispatched to distant provinces through strategic marriages. A father's affection in the Persian court may sound like protection. Here would prove to be the beginning of her downfall. Everything changed during a single banquet in 499 BC. According to Greek and Persian accounts, though the details vary, the core of the story remains horrifyingly consistent. Herodotus preserves the most complete version, drawing on testimonies from Persian courtiers who later fled to Greece. In this telling, Xerxes had been drinking for days, surrounded by flatterers feeding his sense of divinity and power. In a moment of drunken bravado, he stood before thousands of guests and swore an oath by the Persian gods. He would grant any request made of him. This promise was catastrophic, and someone in that hall already knew it. Artabanus, an aging general once loyal to Xerxes' father Darius, had lost 3 wives already. Over 60, ambitious, and increasingly sidelined at court, he understood the political value of binding himself to the royal bloodline. He also understood something else. Xerxes could not break a public oath, not after the humiliation of his military failures in Greece. To refuse a request now would signal weakness to the entire empire. So Artabanus rose, he bowed, and he asked for what no one imagined he would dare request. He asked for the king's daughter. He asked for a mistress. A silence fell so thick it seemed to swallow the hall. Guests stared between the general and the king, fully aware of the audacity of the demand. Royal princesses almost never married ordinary subjects, and when they did, it was to noble young princes, not elderly generals. Everyone waited for Xerxes to refuse. Everyone expected outrage. Everyone was wrong, because Xerxes had sworn a public oath he could not break. Herodotus describes the king turning pale, gripping the arms of his throne, glancing around like a trapped animal. Minutes passed, long, suffocating minutes, before he finally forced out a single word. Granted. And with that, Amestris' fate was sealed. According to later fragments, she attempted to plead with her father afterward. She begged him privately to undo the promise, to find a loophole, to save her from the life she already feared. But Xerxes, torn between genuine affection and the need to preserve the image of a flawless ruler, chose the image. He rationalized his decision through politics. Artabanus, humiliated publicly, could become a dangerous enemy. Binding him through marriage would stabilize the court. That is what he told himself, repeating the same justification whispered by countless autocrats throughout history. The good of the state outweighs the life of a daughter. 3 months later, the marriage was carried out with all the spectacle expected for a princess of Persia. But those who witnessed it remembered something else entirely. Beneath the silk and jewels worth more than entire cities, Amestris moved like a performer trained to conceal despair. Her beauty made the tragedy sharper, more visible. She walked through the ritual silently, her expression fixed somewhere between duty and dread. Artabanus, meanwhile, radiated triumph. He had secured not only a young and beautiful wife, but a permanent, intimate connection to the Achaemenid bloodline. And though the ceremony ended, the true consequences of Xerxes' decision were only beginning to unfold. They were far darker than anyone in that hall could imagine. The age difference between them was staggering. Amestris was barely 14. Artabanus was well past 60. Even in a society where such marriages were not unusual, this particular pairing unsettled the palace. Whispers circulated in corridors and courtyard, murmurs of Xerxes' cruelty in sacrificing his daughter simply to protect his pride. And those whispers would only grow louder as the truth of her marriage began to reveal itself. Because the first months made something painfully clear. Amestris had not entered a marriage. She had entered a sentence. Artabanus, consumed by the desire to control and display his royal bride, kept her in near total isolation. Sources recount how he forbade Amestris from visiting her family quarters or speaking with her sisters and mother. In Persian culture, where female kinship was a vital source of emotional support and identity, this severing of ties was especially cruel. Amestris was effectively imprisoned in Artabanus' quarters, guarded by servants fiercely loyal to him. She had no freedom of movement, no privacy, no autonomy of any kind. Fragmented correspondence suggests she tried sending secret messages to her father, begging for intervention, but Xerxes, ashamed of his own decision yet unable to undo it, without admitting weakness, never answered. That silence would haunt her. The most disturbing element of Artabanus' treatment involved his conjugal expectations. Ancient sources, cautious in their language, still make it clear. Despite his advanced age, he subjected Amestris to frequent and forced marital demands. His obsession centered on producing an heir with royal blood, an heir who would secure his position in the imperial hierarchy. Court physicians were summoned. Administrative tablets record payments to fertility specialists, herbs and concoctions meant to enhance conception. None of this was for Amestris' benefit. She was not regarded as a wife. She was a vessel, a body to be used for political inheritance. 3 years into the marriage, in 4076 BC, Amestris became pregnant. Artabanus rejoiced, offering grand sacrifices to the Persian gods. For him, the child represented triumph. For Amestris, the pregnancy meant something far darker. She understood that if she delivered the heir he desired, she would be bound to him permanently. Mothers of royal children could not be dismissed, divorced, or released. Her fate would be sealed forever. Servants later described her pregnancy as overshadowed by profound sorrow. She spent hours staring out toward the palace gardens where she once danced freely, tears sliding down her face in silence. She often refused food, forcing attendants to intervene. The girl who once moved with grace now moved only with dread. In her 9th month, she entered labor. A grueling ordeal that stretched across 2 days. Court midwives documented severe complications. When the child finally arrived, a boy Artabanus immediately named Xerxes. Honoring his imperial grandfather, it was clear the infant was dangerously weak. Palace physicians doubted he would survive, but Artabanus ignored every warning and began planning ceremonies for the child's presentation. Those ceremonies would never come. 10 days later, the baby died. Official records attributed the death to respiratory failure, but in the shadows of the palace, darker rumors circulated. Some whispered that Amestris, driven to utter despair, had taken the baby's life herself as the only escape left to her. Others claimed loyal servants, horrified by her suffering, had deliberately neglected the child. No evidence confirms any version. Yet the fact these rumors existed at all reveals how desperate and unbearable her life had become. And those whispers had consequences. The baby's death unleashed something terrible within Artabanus. Convinced that a mistress or her attendants were responsible, he became increasingly abusive and controlling. Servants reported hearing screams from behind closed doors. They saw a mistress with bruises on her arms and face. On one recorded occasion, Artabanus beat her so severely she remained bedridden for weeks. When her body healed, something inside her did not. Witnesses described a profound psychological collapse. The young woman who had once pleaded, resisted, searched for small acts of freedom now moved through life like a shadow. She ate only when forced. She rarely spoke. She spent hours unmoving, staring at nothing, her spirit hollowed out. Xerxes was eventually informed of her condition. Only then did he seem to recognize the magnitude of what he had done to his own daughter. Some sources suggest he attempted a discreet intervention, ordering Artabanus to treat a mistress more gently. But on this matter, the king's authority meant little. Artabanus, now tied to the royal family through marriage, and fully aware that Xerxes had sacrificed his daughter to preserve his own image, understood the king's weakness. His influence within the palace had grown, and he knew he could act without consequence, because the king who created her suffering was the same king who could no longer stop it. Artabanus responded to Xerxes' private warnings with veiled reminders. The king himself had consented to the marriage, and according to Persian custom, the treatment of a wife fell entirely under her husband's authority. To challenge that would be to challenge the very traditions that upheld imperial rule, and Xerxes, caught in a trap of his own making, stepped back. A mistress would remain with Artabanus. Her suffering would continue without interference, but history has a way of turning on the decisions we try hardest to ignore. 14 years after a mistress's marriage, everything changed. Xerxes was assassinated in a palace coup led by Artabanus and several conspirators. The motivations were complex: succession politics, rival factions, long-standing grievances. Yet some accounts claim that Artabanus twisted a mistress's suffering into a justification for murder. He allegedly told his allies that Xerxes had become a weak tyrant, a man so lacking in judgment that he had sacrificed his own daughter to maintain an image. It was a breathtaking display of hypocrisy. The very cruelty he had inflicted became the excuse he used to kill the man who had allowed it. The coup succeeded for a moment. Artabanus seized control of the palace and ruled behind the scenes for 7 months. But eventually Xerxes' son Artaxerxes rallied loyal forces, crushed the rebellion, and confronted the general in the palace. Artabanus was executed in a violent clash with the royal guard. His reign of influence ended with the same brutality he had inflicted on the young woman he had imprisoned. One might imagine that his death brought a mistress freedom, perhaps even joy, but the truth was far more tragic. By then, a mistress was 28 years old. Yet witnesses described a woman who seemed decades older. Her hair had turned prematurely gray. Her face was hollow, her expression vacant. Artaxerxes, her half-brother and now great king, tried to restore her place at court. He offered her private quarters, servants, and the autonomy she had been denied for so long. But a mistress rarely stepped outside her rooms. She refused banquets, ceremonies, and festivals. Servants noted she could spend entire days in silence, sometimes weeks, without uttering a single word. One day, musicians were sent to lift her spirits. They played a melody she had once danced to on that distant night in 479 BC, before everything was taken from her. The moment she heard it, something inside her snapped. A mistress screamed, a raw, ruptured sound that shattered the hall. She hurled the instruments aside before collapsing into tears. The first she had cried in years. She would not recover. A mistress died at the age of 36. Contemporary sources speak vaguely of prolonged illness, but modern interpretation suggests something far more devastating: slow self-starvation. A form of surrender that allowed her the only control she had ever been permitted. Others point to severe depression leading to complete physical decline. Whatever the medical cause, those who lived alongside her understood the deeper truth. Amestris did not die in 477 BC. She died the night her father said granted. Her body continued for 2 more decades, but her spirit had already been erased long before. Her story was buried, as so many were. Achaemenid royal inscriptions never mention her. Xerxes is remembered as the builder of Persepolis, the ruler who challenged Greece, not the man who sacrificed his daughter to preserve his pride. Only in Greek accounts, in Herodotus and later chroniclers who gathered Persian oral traditions, do fragments of her tragedy survive. Even there, she appears not as a fully realized human being, but as a footnote illustrating the excesses of the Persian court. Yet when we examine the surviving fragments, the administrative tablets, and the faint echoes in ancient texts, we can reconstruct the outline of a life shaped entirely by suffering. Suffering born from a single impulsive decision made by a father drunk on power and surrounded by sycophants. Amestris' story forces us to confront a universal truth. The most devastating acts of violence are not always carried out by enemies or armies, but by those closest to us. Parents, rulers, guardians who wield unchecked authority without conscience. Xerxes did not strike her. He did not imprison her. He did not order her death. But through one careless promise spoken to impress a crowd, he destroyed her, just as surely as any torturer. This is the cruelty of absolute power, violence that leaves no visible wounds yet breaks a life completely. The tragedy of a mistress is the tragedy of all who live beneath unrestrained authority. Where the will of one individual becomes fate for everyone beneath them. Her story, preserved only in scattered fragments across 2,500 years, reminds us that the greatest horrors often unfold not in war or rebellion, but in the quiet decisions made behind palace walls. Decisions that powerful men never revisit, but that their children never escape. This has been Crimson Legacy Historians. If this account moved you, subscribe and leave a comment about which empire or historical figure we should uncover next. If you stayed with us until the very end, write a mistress in the comments below so we know you walked with us through this entire story.